The clinking of silverware and murmured conversations filled the luxurious Lancaster restaurant. But near the kitchen entrance, an elderly black woman sat alone, her table bare except for an empty water glass. The waiter, Liam Draper, finally stopped by, his expression tight with irritation. "Still haven't figured out what you want?" he muttered, turning away without waiting for an answer. Across the room, a sharply dressed man froze mid-step. His gaze locked onto the woman, and his face darkened. "That's my mother," Jordan Parker said coldly. "You just made the worst mistake of your career. Before we dive into the full story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, hit a like and subscribe for more stories like this." 8 hours earlier, the sun peeked through the blinds of a modest but elegant townhouse in Atlanta. Inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Mrs. Vivian Parker, an elderly black woman in her late 70s, stood by the kitchen window sipping from her favorite porcelain mug. The delicate floral design on the cup matched the embroidered housecoat she wore, a quiet nod to the past, to the years when craftsmanship mattered. The morning was peaceful, almost deceptively so. Birds chirped outside, and the distant hum of traffic hinted at the bustling city beyond her quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Parker, ever graceful despite the years etched into her skin, checked her watch. It was nearly 11, and she had a lunch reservation at Lancaster, one of Atlanta's most prestigious restaurants. Her son, Jordan Parker, had made the reservation days ago, eager to share a meal with her before flying back to New York. Jordan was everything a mother could hope for, a successful civil rights attorney, known for his sharp mind and unwavering determination. He had built a name for himself fighting systemic discrimination, taking on cases others deemed too complicated or unwinnable. But to Mrs. Parker, he was simply her boy, the same curious child who once asked why some playgrounds had nicer swings than others. As she set down her mug, the phone buzzed. Jordan's name flashed across the screen. "Morning, Mama," his warm voice greeted her. "You still on for lunch?" Mrs. Parker smiled. "Of course, baby. I'm looking forward to it." "Good. I'm tied up with a quick meeting, but I'll meet you there. You sure you don't want me to send a car?" She chuckled softly. "Jordan, I've been getting around this city long before you were born. I can manage." They exchanged goodbyes, and Mrs. Parker headed upstairs to get ready. She chose her outfit with care, a navy blue coat with delicate embroidery along the cuffs, paired with a pearl necklace her late husband had gifted her on their 30th anniversary. She pinned a small golden diamond brooch to her coat lapel, a symbol of resilience and dignity. It wasn't flashy, but it held history, much like her. By noon, she was walking down her front steps, her posture as straight as ever. She waved to her neighbor, an elderly white woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who smiled warmly. "Going somewhere special, Vivian?" Mrs. Caldwell called out. "Lunch with my son," Mrs. Parker replied. "A fancy place this time." "Well, you deserve it. Enjoy yourself." The Uber ride was smooth, though the driver, a younger white man, seemed surprised when she confirmed the destination. "Lancaster, huh?" he muttered under his breath, as if the restaurant were reserved for a different clientele. Mrs. Parker, ever composed, ignored the slight. While the city passed by outside the window, her thoughts drifted to Jordan. He had flown in the night before for a conference addressing systemic racism, specifically how it often hides in plain sight, unequal treatment in schools, biased lending practices, and yes, the hospitality industry. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had lived through the civil rights movement, marched alongside friends who risked everything for the promise of equality, and yet here they were, decades later, still fighting shadows. The car pulled up to Lancaster, its polished glass facade reflecting the bright Georgia sun. A valet, a young white man with slicked back hair, barely glanced at her as he opened the door. His indifference didn't surprise her. Lancaster had a reputation, not just for fine dining, but for being the kind of place where privilege walked in without question, and difference was met with thinly veiled disdain. Mrs. Parker stepped out, adjusted her coat, and walked toward the entrance, her handbag tucked securely under her arm. The hostess stand was manned by a young woman in her early 20s, Sierra, with platinum blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun. Sierra's smile faltered the moment she looked up and saw Mrs. Parker standing there, alone. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Sierra asked, her tone polite but clipped. "Yes, dear. I have a reservation under the name Parker, 12:30. Sierra's eyes flicked down to the reservation list, and for a moment, her brow furrowed. Mrs. Parker knew that look. The quick calculation, the internal debate of whether someone like her truly belonged here. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Sierra hesitated, glancing toward the dining room. "We're actually pretty booked right now. Are you sure you had a reservation?" Mrs. Parker's smile didn't waver. "I'm sure, my son made it days ago." Reluctantly, Sierra scanned the list again and found the name. Her expression tightened. "Right, Parker, got it." She grabbed 2 menus but didn't motion toward the well-lit main dining area. Instead, she led Mrs. Parker through the room, past tables set with crisp white linens and sparkling crystal glasses, past the windows with a view of the city skyline, and straight toward a small, dimly lit corner near the kitchen doors. The table wobbled slightly as Sierra placed the menus. Down. "Here you go, your server will be with you shortly." Mrs. Parker glanced around. This wasn't a seating mistake, it was deliberate. She could see the pattern. Young couples, mostly white, seated near the windows. Businessmen in tailored suits enjoying the quiet ambiance of the central floor, and her tucked away as though her presence might tarnish the restaurant's pristine image. But she didn't complain. She never did. Complaints, she had learned long ago, often led to more mistreatment, not less. Instead, she settled into the chair, folded her hands on the table and waited. Minutes passed, then several more. Other guests were seated, orders taken, drinks served. A white couple who had arrived long after her was already sipping Chardonnay and sharing an appetizer. Her table remained bare. From her seat, she could see into the dining room where Jordan had just arrived, shaking hands with a colleague. He hadn't seen her yet, and she decided not to text him. Not yet. She wanted to see how far this would. The waiter finally appeared. Liam Draper, a tall man with neatly trimmed hair and an air of casual arrogance. He walked past her table twice, laughing with another server, Maya, and refilling water glasses nearby without so much as glancing. In her direction, it wasn't until Mrs. Parker gently raised her hand that Liam finally stopped. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah?" he said, as if she were an interruption, not a customer. "I'd like to order if you're not too busy," she said, her tone polite but firm. Liam's gaze swept over her, dismissive. "We're a little understaffed today. I'll get to you when I can." He turned and walked away without writing down her order. Across the room, Jordan glanced toward the corner, noticing his mother for the first time. His smile faded as he watched the interaction unfold. Mrs. Parker sat quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of her water glass, which remained empty. She had been here before, not just in this restaurant, but in countless other places, where the weight of prejudice settled like an unwelcome guest at the table. But she had learned long ago that dignity, once surrendered, was hard to reclaim. Her phone vibrated, a message from Jordan. "Everything okay, Mama?" She smiled faintly and typed, "Back. Same story, different day. Don't come over. I want to see how this plays out." Jordan, ever the strategist, respected her wishes, but he watched closely, his jaw tightening with each passing minute. And that's when Liam walked by again, this time without even pretending to look her way. The final insult wasn't loud or dramatic. It was silent, insidious, the deliberate act of making someone feel invisible. Mrs. Parker exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised, but she was disappointed. She glanced toward the dining room where Jordan now stood, his face unreadable as he watched Liam laugh with another table, entirely unaware that his casual cruelty had just lit the first spark of a fire that would consume everything he thought he controlled. Mrs. Vivian Parker sat quietly at her corner table, her hands resting gently on the pristine white tablecloth. Around her, the restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation, laughter, and the soft clink of silverware against china. The ambiance was everything Lancaster prided itself on: exclusive, elegant, and, as Mrs. Parker knew all too well, meticulously designed to cater to a very particular clientele. She glanced toward the main dining area, where her son, Jordan Parker, now sat, engaged, in conversation with two colleagues from his conference. His face was serious, brows furrowed as he listened intently. He hadn't seen her yet, and she didn't text him this time. She wanted to observe, to understand how deep the problem ran. Liam Draper, the waiter assigned to her section, strolled by, once more his notepad tucked into his apron. He didn't glance her way. Instead, he leaned against the bar, joking with Maya, the server from the other section. The two laughed quietly, Liam occasionally throwing a glance toward Mrs. Parker's table, but never approaching. The dismissal was subtle but deliberate. This wasn't about being busy or short-staffed. It was about something more ingrained, more insidious, the kind of prejudice that hides behind polite smiles and hollow apologies. Minutes ticked by. The young white couple seated 2 tables away had already received their appetizers, artfully plated scallops glistening under the soft light. The woman glanced toward Mrs. Parker, then whispered something to her partner, who shrugged without looking up from his phone. Across the room, Jordan finally noticed. His gaze shifted, his conversation fading into background noise as he watched his mother, poised and patient, sitting at an empty table while the restaurant buzzed around her. Pretending she didn't exist, his jaw tightened. He started to rise, but his phone buzzed before he could take a step. A single message from his mother. "Sit. I want to see how far this goes." Jordan hesitated, then sank back into his chair, his eyes never leaving her table. At the hostess stand, Sierra, the same woman who had reluctantly seated Mrs. Parker, chatted with another employee. The conversation was light, casual, until the employee nodded toward Mrs. Parker's table. "She's still here," the man muttered, his tone dripping with disbelief. Sierra sighed. "Yeah, guess she's waiting for someone important. Or just trying to make a statement," the man said, rolling his eyes. Mrs. Parker, though seemingly focused on the menu in front of her, missed nothing. She heard the whispers, saw the sidelong glances, felt the weight of silent judgment. This wasn't new. It was history, repeating itself in a new setting under softer lights and with more expensive furnishings. Finally, Liam approached, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting. He simply stood there, pen poised, above his notepad. "Still haven't figured out what you want?" he asked, his tone bordering on exasperation, as though her very presence inconvenienced him. Mrs. Parker looked up, meeting his gaze with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered far worse storms. "I'm ready to order now," she said, her voice calm and steady. Liam scribbled something on his pad without making eye contact. "Great, I'll put it in when I get a chance." He didn't wait for a thank you. He simply turned and walked away, the notepad shoved back into his apron as though the interaction had already slipped from his mind. Across the room, Jordan's hand clenched into a fist under the table. One of his colleagues, a black woman named Renee, followed his gaze and frowned. "Your mum?" she asked quietly. Jordan nodded, his face unreadable. Renee's expression darkened. "Do they know who she is?" "No," Jordan muttered. "And that's the point." Mrs. Parker sat back in her chair, watching the room. The walls were adorned with modern art, abstract shapes in muted tones, elegant but impersonal. The soft jazz drifting from the speakers did little to soften the sharp edges of exclusion that cut through the air around her. She reached for her water glass, only to find it still empty. Across the room, Liam poured sparkling water into the glasses of a table of young professionals, all white, all laughing without a care in the world. It wasn't just negligence. It was intentional. Another 10 minutes passed, then 15. Mrs. Parker's meal never arrived. Her menu remained untouched, her water glass dry. Patrons came and went, waiters bustled about, but her corner remained an island of exclusion. Finally, Jordan stood. He couldn't watch anymore. But just as he began to weave through the tables toward his mother, something unexpected happened. A woman at a nearby table, perhaps in her 40s, raised her hand and flagged down Maya, the server Liam had been chatting with earlier. "Excuse me?" the woman said, her voice firm but polite. "That woman's been sitting there for nearly an hour without service. Is there a reason for that?" Maya blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, that's not my section." The woman's eyes narrowed. That's not what I asked. I asked why she hasn't been served. The conversation drew the attention of nearby diners. Heads turned. Whispers spread like wildfire. The illusion of polite ignorance was beginning to crack. Liam, noticing the shift in energy, sauntered over, irritation written all over his face. Is there a problem here? The woman gestured toward Mrs. Parker's table. Yes, there is. Why hasn't she been served? Liam's smile was thin, forced. We're a little short-staffed today. We're doing our best. Funny, the woman shot back, because everyone else seems to be getting along just fine. Liam's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. She's not being served because someone decided she doesn't belong here. It was Jordan. He stood tall, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression cold and controlled. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward him as he stepped closer to his mother's table. Liam blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down. Jordan didn't flinch. Calm down? He repeated, his voice like steel. My mother has been sitting here for nearly an hour without service, while tables around her, tables with white patrons, have been served multiple courses. That's not short-staffed. That's discrimination. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some patrons looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched, wide-eyed, as the scene unfolded. Mrs. Parker, ever composed, sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jordan was speaking for every moment she had swallowed in dignity and silence. Liam's face flushed. Look, I don't make the rules. I just follow them. Jordan's eyes narrowed. That's the problem. The restaurant manager, Ryan Calloway, appeared then, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He was a middle-aged white man with salt and pepper hair, his tailored suit screaming authority. He offered Jordan a practiced smile, the kind designed to diffuse tensions without acknowledging fault. Sir, Ryan began smoothly, if there's been some misunderstanding, I apologize. But causing a scene isn't helping anyone. Jordan didn't budge. A misunderstanding. He gestured toward his mother. My mother has been humiliated in your establishment, and you call that a misunderstanding? Ryan's smile tightened. Perhaps this isn't the right restaurant for your family? The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Jordan stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he pulled out his phone and started dialing. Ryan's smile faltered. What are you doing? Calling someone who actually cares about misunderstandings, Jordan replied coolly. And trust me, when they get here, you'll wish you'd handled this differently. The room was silent except for the soft hum of conversation from the far end of the dining area, where oblivious patrons continued their meals, unaware that the restaurant's polished facade was beginning to crack. Mrs. Parker watched her son, pride gleaming in her eyes. She had taught him to fight with words, to stand tall without raising a fist, and here he was, living proof that her lessons had taken root. But the question lingered in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire. How much further would this go, before someone finally put an end to it? Comment number 1 if you believe Mrs. Parker deserved better treatment from the start. Like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe no one should have to fight for basic respect. And here's the real question. When the truth about who Mrs. Parker really is comes to light, will it be enough to make them regret their actions? Or will they double down and make things even worse? Stay tuned to find out. The restaurant's atmosphere, once filled with quiet chatter and soft jazz, now buzzed with an undercurrent of tension. Eyes flickered toward Mrs. Parker's table, where she sat with the grace of someone who had weathered far greater storms. The commotion caused by Jordan's intervention had drawn attention, but the restaurant staff seemed determined to maintain their indifference, as though ignoring the issue would make it disappear. Liam Draper stood frozen for a moment, his notepad dangling from one hand while his other clenched into a fist at his side. He glanced toward the manager, Ryan Calloway, who gave a slight nod, silently signaling for Liam to continue ignoring the table. The message was clear. Let them wait. Let them get frustrated and leave. But Mrs. Parker didn't move. She sat calmly, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. She had lived through sit-ins, marches, and silent protests. Waiting, while uncomfortable, was not unfamiliar territory. Jordan, however, was less patient. He remained standing, beside his mother's table, phone in hand, his thumb hovering over the screen. He could have called the media, a colleague, or even one of his contacts in the city council. But something held him back. His mother's presence, her silent strength, reminded him that this wasn't just about making noise. It was about exposing the quiet cruelty that thrived in places like Lancaster. From the bar, Maya, the other server, watched nervously. She had worked at Lancaster for over a year and had seen this pattern before, though never so blatantly. Elderly black patrons seated near the kitchen, families mistakenly skipped when it came to dessert menus, and subtle glances exchanged between staff when someone didn't fit the usual profile of their clientele. Maya's feet moved before her mind caught up. She grabbed a water pitcher and started toward Mrs. Parker's table, her heart pounding. But before she could get there, Liam intercepted her. "What are you doing?" he hissed, blocking her path. "She's been sitting there forever, Liam," Maya whispered back, glancing toward Mrs. Parker. "This is ridiculous." Liam sneered. "Not your section. Stay out of it." Maya hesitated, torn between her paycheck and her conscience. Finally, she stepped back, frustration etched across her face. She wasn't in a position to challenge the system, not yet anyway. Across the room, Jordan noticed the brief exchange. His eyes narrowed. He knew this dance all too well. Racism didn't always announce itself with slurs or violence. Sometimes it crept in through policies, unspoken rules, and silent complicity. He returned to his table, where his colleague Renee and another conference attendee, Marcus, sat watching the scene unfold. Renee's lips were pressed into a thin line, her usual warmth replaced by simmering anger. "This happen often?" Marcus asked quietly, his gaze flickering between Mrs. Parker and the restaurant staff. Renee nodded. "More than you'd think. Lancaster's got a reputation, but they're careful. It's always just subtle enough to give them plausible deniability." Jordan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "Well, they picked the wrong person. Today." He motioned for the check, signaling to the bartender instead of waiting for Liam. The bartender, an older man named Greg, hesitated, clearly aware of the tension but unwilling to get involved. He slid the check across the counter without a word. Jordan glanced at it, pulled out his card, and left a generous tip, not for the service, but for the moment he was about to create. As he stood, he sent a quick text to his legal assistant. "Flag Lancaster, potential civil rights case, gather complaints if any exist." The next few minutes passed like a slow-motion sequence. Mrs. Parker remained seated, calm but alert, while Jordan quietly observed the staff. Liam continued serving other tables, his cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the cold dismissal he had shown Mrs. Parker. Ryan, the manager, hovered near the hostess stand, pretending to check reservations while keeping an eye on the situation. And then, as if fate wanted to underscore the injustice, a young white couple entered the restaurant. They were dressed casually, far less polished than Lancaster's usual clientele. The woman wore jeans and a sweater, while the man sported a hoodie with the logo of a local college. Sierra, the hostess who had begrudgingly seated Mrs. Parker earlier, greeted them with a bright smile. "Welcome to Lancaster. Do you have a reservation?" The man shook his head. "Nope, just thought we'd try our luck." Sierra's smile didn't falter. "Of course, right this way." Without hesitation, she led them past Mrs. Parker's corner, past the empty water glass and untouched menu, and seated them at a prime table near the window. Jordan watched, his anger sharpening into resolve. It was no longer just about his mother. It was about a system so entrenched that it operated without shame, even under scrutiny. He stepped back toward his mother's table, his presence commanding attention. Conversations quieted. The pianist in the corner, oblivious to the tension, continued playing a soft, jazzy tune that felt painfully out of place. "Mom," Jordan said quietly, "do you want to leave?" Mrs. Parker looked up at her son, her eyes calm but resolute. "No, baby, I want to finish what we started." Jordan nodded, respect deepening the lines of his face. He knew better than to argue. His mother had faced down worse enemies than An arrogant waiter and a complicit manager. She wasn't about to back down now. Across the room, Maya caught Jordan's eye and gave a barely perceptible nod. She wasn't brave enough to confront her co-workers directly, but she would document everything. Quiet resistance. The kind that often went unnoticed but could tip the scales when the time was right. Liam strolled past the table again, this time not even pretending to glance their way. He laughed at something another server said. The sound, grating against the tension hanging in the air. Jordan's phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Lancaster has multiple flagged reviews for discrimination. Some removed, but archives hold receipts. Do you want me to escalate? Jordan didn't reply. Not yet. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his mind already working through the next steps. Meanwhile, Ryan Calloway approached, his expression carefully composed. He stopped just short of Mrs. Parker's table, his hands clasped in front of him like a politician delivering bad news. "Sir," he said, addressing Jordan instead of Mrs. Parker, "I'm going to have to ask you both to leave. You're causing a disturbance, and it's affecting the experience of our other guests." Jordan stared at him, incredulous. "A disturbance? My mother sat here quietly for an hour without service. That's the only disturbance." Ryan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have to involve security." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Security, a word that, in contexts like this, often translated to law enforcement. Mrs. Parker remained silent, her gaze unwavering. Jordan, however, leaned in slightly, his voice low and precise. "Go ahead," he said. "Call them, and while you're at it, let them know they'll be walking into a civil rights violation in progress. I'll make sure the recording goes directly to my office, the local news, and the city council." Ryan's composure cracked just for a moment. He hadn't expected resistance, not from someone who looked as polished and professional as Jordan. Prejudice often relied on assumptions, and Jordan had just shattered one of them. But Ryan was too entrenched in his role to back down. He straightened, his tone sharpening. "Do what you have to do. Just know that making a scene here won't change anything." Jordan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's where you're wrong. It changes everything." The restaurant's quiet hum had ceased entirely. Patrons watched, some with morbid curiosity, others with genuine discomfort. A few whispered among themselves, while others deliberately avoided eye contact, pretending nothing was happening. Mrs. Parker, ever the educator, finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "It's not the big moments that reveal character," she said, addressing no one in particular. "It's the small ones, the choices we make when we think no one's watching." Ryan blinked, caught off guard by her calm eloquence. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Jordan stepped back, slipping his phone out once more. This time he didn't hesitate. He typed a single word to his assistant. "Escalate." The response came almost instantly. On it. And just like that, the situation crossed the line from personal slight to systemic exposure. Jordan wasn't just fighting for his mother anymore. He was fighting against a pattern that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. Ryan seemed to realize a second too late that he had underestimated both mother and son. His authority, once absolute within the walls of Lancaster, now felt fragile like glass under pressure. The pianist, oblivious to the shifting power dynamics, continued to play, but the melody no longer felt soothing. It felt like the calm before a storm. Mrs. Parker sat motionless, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. The soft hum of conversation in the restaurant had all but vanished, replaced by an uneasy silence. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken tension, like the moments before a summer storm. Liam Draper, the waiter who had so effortlessly dismissed her earlier, now stood near the bar chatting with another server. His laughter cut through the quiet like a knife, oblivious to the growing unease spreading across the room. He hadn't glanced toward Mrs. Parker's table in nearly 20 minutes, despite passing by multiple times with plates bound for other guests. Jordan Parker remained standing beside his mother, his face unreadable, but his posture tense. He could argue, could shout, could demand immediate service, but he knew better. That's what they expected. A scene, a moment they could twist to justify their behavior. Instead, he waited, watching, calculating. Finally, Liam, clearly emboldened by the lack of managerial intervention, strolled past Mrs. Parker's table once more. This time she raised her hand, a small graceful motion that stopped him in his tracks. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice steady. "It's been quite some time. I'd like to place my order now." Liam's smile was thin, patronizing. "Still here," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Figured you'd have taken the hint by now." Jordan's eyes darkened, but Mrs. Parker didn't flinch. She met Liam's gaze with the calm resilience of someone who had faced down far greater indignities. "I'm ready to order," she repeated, her tone unwavering. Liam sighed dramatically, pulling out his notepad with exaggerated slowness. "Fine. What'll it be?" Mrs. Parker ordered a simple meal, a garden salad, grilled salmon, a glass of iced tea. There was nothing complicated about it, nothing that could justify further delay. Liam scribbled down the order without making eye contact, then stuffed the notepad back into his apron. "Happy now," he muttered under his breath as he turned away. Jordan stepped forward. "Excuse me?" His voice was cold, sharp, cutting through the room like glass shattering. Liam froze, then slowly turned, his expression hardening. "Something you need, sir?" Jordan's smile was tight, forced. "I need you to explain why you think it's acceptable to speak to my mother that way." Liam blinked, caught off guard. He glanced around as if searching for backup, but the other staff members suddenly found the floors and walls incredibly interesting. "I didn't say anything," Liam protested, his voice defensive. "She placed her order and I took it. End of story." Jordan took a step closer, his gaze steady. "No, the story doesn't end there, because you didn't just ignore her for an hour. You didn't just refuse her water or avoid her table. You made a choice. A deliberate, conscious choice to treat her as less than. And now you're trying to pretend it didn't happen." Liam's jaw clenched. "Look, man, I don't have time for this. We're busy. If you don't like the service, you're welcome to leave." That was the moment the room truly shifted. Conversations stopped entirely. Patrons who had previously avoided eye contact now watched with rapt attention. Even the pianist in the corner hesitated, fingers hovering above the keys as if unsure whether to continue playing. Jordan's expression didn't change. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "Is that how Lancaster handles its guests?" he asked, his words slow and deliberate. "Because if so, I'll make sure every person in this city knows exactly what hospitality looks like here." Liam's face reddened, but before he could respond, the restaurant manager, Ryan Calloway, appeared once more, his polished demeanor firmly in place. "Sir," Ryan began, his tone clipped but polite, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing the other guests." Jordan didn't budge. He gestured toward his mother. "My mother has been sitting here for over an hour without so much as a glass of water, while tables seated long after her enjoy full service. That's the real disturbance, and it seems everyone here knows it except your staff." Ryan's smile thinned. "If you're unhappy with the service, I'd be happy to comp your meal. But if this continues, I'll have no choice but to ask you to leave." Mrs. Parker finally spoke, her voice soft but carrying the weight of experience. "It's not about the meal," she said quietly. "It's about dignity." Ryan blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He hadn't expected her to speak, hadn't expected the quiet authority in her tone. "I've sat here," she continued, "watched tables turn over, watched glasses filled and refilled, while I've been treated like an afterthought, not because the staff is busy, but because someone decided I didn't belong." Her gaze swept across the room, landing on Liam, who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. "This isn't the first time I've faced this," she added, "but it might be the last time I stay silent about it." The room held its breath. Even the diners who had previously ignored the situation now seemed unable to look away. The truth, spoken plainly and without anger, had a way of cutting deeper than any shouted accusation. Ryan cleared his throat, struggling to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, I assure you, Lancaster prides itself on its service. If there's been a misunderstanding, there was no misunderstanding," Jordan interrupted, his voice cold. There was a choice, and everyone here saw it. The silence that followed was deafening. Liam shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance drained away, replaced by a flicker of something closer to panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. It was Mrs. Parker who broke the silence. She reached into her handbag, pulled out her wallet, and placed a crisp $20 bill on the table beside the untouched water glass. "I won't be staying for lunch," she said quietly, rising to her feet with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying herself with dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. "But I'll leave this here for the service I never received." Jordan stepped beside her, his hand gently resting on her elbow. His eyes met Ryan's, then Liam's, holding their gaze until both men looked away. The moment stretched, heavy, with unspoken consequences, and then, without another word, Mrs. Parker turned and walked toward the exit, her son by her side. As they passed through the restaurant, the patrons parted like water, some lowering their gazes in shame, others watching. With quiet admiration, no one spoke, no one dared. It wasn't until they reached the door that Jordan finally spoke again, his voice low but firm. "You'll regret this," he said, glancing back at Ryan and Liam. "Not because of who we are, but because of what you chose to reveal about yourselves." And then they were gone, leaving behind an emptiness that the soft jazz and murmured conversations couldn't quite fill. Comment number 1 if you believe Mrs. Parker deserved better from the start. Like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe no one should ever have to fight for basic respect. But here's the real question. Did Lancaster just make a mistake they can't recover from? Or will they double down, refusing to acknowledge the damage they've done? Stay tuned to find out what happens next. The restaurant hung in a tense silence, broken only by the faint clinking of silverware and murmured conversations from the far side of the dining room, where patrons pretended not to notice the unfolding confrontation. Mrs. Parker sat quietly, her expression composed, while Jordan stood beside her, his phone still in hand. His message had been sent. Now he waited. Liam Draper, the waiter whose thinly veiled disdain had sparked the escalation, hovered near the bar, watching the scene with crossed arms and a smirk that barely masked his unease. He glanced at Ryan Calloway, the restaurant manager, who stood rigid near the hostess stand, pretending to check the reservation book while keeping a watchful eye on Jordan. Finally, Liam, perhaps emboldened by Ryan's silence, stepped forward. "Sir, if you're not ordering, I'll have to ask you to leave. We don't need this kind of drama here." Jordan's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unwavering. "Drama?" His voice was calm, controlled, but each word cut through the air like glass. "You ignored my mother for nearly an hour. You walked past her table like she didn't exist. That's not drama, that's discrimination." Liam's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Look, I didn't mean—" Jordan cut him off. "You didn't mean what, exactly? To treat an elderly black woman with the same respect you so effortlessly show every other customer here? Or did you think no one would notice because she's quiet and dignified instead of loud and demanding?" Liam flushed, his posture shifting defensively. "I treat everyone the same." "That's a lie," Jordan snapped, his patience wearing thin. He pointed toward the young white couple who had arrived long after his mother and were now enjoying their main course by the window. "They walked in without a reservation, and you seated them immediately. You poured their water, took their order, and served their appetizers while my mother sat here with an empty glass and an untouched menu." Ryan, sensing the growing intensity, stepped forward, palms raised in mock diplomacy. "Let's not turn this into something it's not," he said smoothly, his practiced smile returning. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." Jordan turned his attention to Ryan, his expression hardening. "Misunderstanding?" he echoed, voice dripping with disbelief. "Your staff ignored my mother because they assumed she didn't belong here, and instead of addressing it, you doubled down, suggesting we leave as if our presence is the problem." Ryan's smile thinned. "Sir, I'm simply trying to maintain order. This is a private establishment, and we reserve the right to refuse service." Jordan's eyes narrowed. "On what grounds?" Because I guarantee that if you're refusing service based on race, you're opening yourself up to a civil rights lawsuit. And trust me, I specialize in those. For the first time, Ryan hesitated. He hadn't expected pushback from someone so composed, so clearly aware of the law. The balance of power in the room shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Mrs. Parker noticed. She had seen this play out before, though rarely with the odds tipping in her favor. Across the room, Maya, the server who had previously tried to intervene, stood frozen near the bar, her hands gripping an empty tray. She glanced at Liam, who was now visibly uncomfortable, then at Ryan, who seemed unsure whether to press forward or back down. But it was Liam, driven by either arrogance or panic, who made the next move. He scoffed, shaking his head. Fancy. Words don't change facts. She was sitting there, wasting time, probably hoping to get a free meal by causing a scene. The words hung in the air like poison, and the restaurant seemed to collectively hold its breath. Jordan's face darkened. He stepped forward, his tone dropping to a dangerous calm. "Do you have any idea who you just insulted?" Liam blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in Jordan's demeanor. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jordan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, gesturing toward his mother, who remained seated, her expression unreadable. "That woman," Jordan said slowly, "is Dr. Vivian Parker, recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, former Dean of Education at Howard University, civil rights activist, author of 3 published works on systemic inequality in education and healthcare. She's advised congressional committees, mentored countless leaders, and shaped policies that protect people from exactly the kind of treatment she's receiving right now." The restaurant fell silent. Even the pianist, sensing the charged atmosphere, stopped playing mid-melody. Patrons who had been quietly observing now leaned in, eyes wide, realizing they were witnessing something far more significant than an ordinary dispute over service. Liam's face drained of color. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words came out. He glanced at Ryan, silently pleading for backup, but the manager looked equally stunned, his usual smug confidence replaced by dawning horror. Ryan recovered first, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Look, Mr. Parker, we didn't know—" "That's the problem," Jordan interrupted coldly. "You didn't bother to know. You saw an elderly black woman sitting alone and assumed she was less important, less deserving of respect. Her accomplishments don't change the fact that she deserved basic human decency from the moment she walked through your doors." Mrs. Parker finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Respect shouldn't be contingent on credentials. It should be the default." Ryan swallowed hard, visibly struggling to regain control of the situation. I'll comp your meal. And of course, I'll ensure this never happens again." Jordan's smile was humorless. "You think this is about a free meal?" He pulled out his phone, thumb flying across the screen. "I'm documenting everything, the reviews, the complaints, the video footage. This restaurant won't just lose business, you'll face a formal investigation." Liam took a step back, his face a mask of panic. "Whoa, wait, that's not necessary. I didn't mean what?" Jordan snapped, turning the full force of his glare on the waiter. "To reveal exactly how you see people like my mother. To remind us that in places like this, dignity is optional for those who don't fit your narrow standards." Ryan, clearly desperate to salvage the situation, raised his hands. "Mr. Parker, let's not escalate this further. We can handle this quietly." Jordan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Quietly? That's how discrimination survives, in silence. I'm done being quiet." He hit send on his phone, and somewhere across the city, his assistant received the final confirmation to escalate the complaint to the Office of Civil Rights and Consumer Protection. The die was cast. For the first time since the confrontation began, Liam looked genuinely afraid. He glanced around the restaurant, realizing that other patrons were now recording the scene on their phones. There would be no sweeping this under. The rug, Mrs. Parker, ever composed, slowly rose from her seat. The room seemed to tilt in her favor as she stood tall, shoulders back, eyes steady. "I've spent my life teaching people to recognize injustice," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the room. "And I've learned that silence is complicity. Every person here who watched and said nothing, who saw and chose comfort over courage, you're part of the problem. Her gaze swept the room, and more than a few diners looked away, shame blooming across their faces. Even those who had silently rooted for her found it hard to meet her eyes. Jordan stepped beside his mother, his presence solid and unwavering. "We're done here," he said, sliding his phone into his pocket. "But this isn't over." As they turned to leave, Maya, the young server who had been silenced earlier, stepped forward. Her voice, though hesitant, carried determination. "Dr. Parker," she called softly. Mrs. Parker paused, turning toward the young woman. "I'm sorry," Maya continued, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I wanted to help earlier, but I was afraid of losing my job." Mrs. Parker's expression softened. She nodded once. "Courage doesn't always come easily, child. But when you find it, hold on to it. It's worth more than any paycheck." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, Jordan at her side. The restaurant, once buzzing with casual conversation and polished indifference, now felt hollow, stripped of its carefully curated facade. Liam stood motionless, his face pale, while Ryan Calloway quietly pulled out his own phone, likely to call the restaurant's owner and brace for the fallout. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jordan glanced at his mother, concern flickering in his eyes. "You okay, Mama?" Mrs. Parker smiled faintly, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I'm tired, son. Tired of fighting battles we should have won decades ago. But I'm proud of you," Jordan exhaled, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. "Proud of us, Mama. We're not done yet." As they walked toward the car, the question lingered between them. What would be the restaurant's next move? Would they back down and issue a hollow apology, or would they, like so many others before them, double down and retaliate? The answer, they both knew, would determine not just the fate of Lancaster, but the message it sent to every other place that still believed dignity was optional. The air inside Lancaster felt charged, like the stillness before a storm. Mrs. Parker remained seated, her back straight, hands resting lightly on the table, eyes calm but alert. Jordan stood beside her, phone in hand, jaw tight with restrained anger. Across from them, Ryan Calloway, the restaurant manager, maintained his forced smile, though the beads of sweat forming at his temple betrayed his unease. Liam Draper, the waiter who had instigated the entire ordeal, leaned against the bar, arms crossed, watching with thinly veiled amusement. To him, this was nothing more than an inconvenience, a power struggle he expected to win. After all, in places like Lancaster, the system always backed those who knew how to play the game. "Sir," Ryan repeated, voice firm but condescending, "I'm going to have to ask you and your mother to leave. You're disrupting the experience for other guests." Jordan didn't move. His phone buzzed again in his hand, a message from his assistant. "Local news has the tip. ETA 10 minutes. Keep them talking." He smiled faintly, a sharp contrast to the tension in his posture. "We're not leaving, Mr. Calloway. My mother made a reservation, arrived on time, and has yet to be served. The only disruption here is the blatant discrimination your staff seems perfectly comfortable with." Ryan's face hardened. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone. That includes customers who create unnecessary conflict." Mrs. Parker finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Is asking for basic respect considered conflict now?" Ryan blinked, momentarily, thrown off by her calm defiance. He recovered quickly, falling back into the authoritative role he was accustomed to playing. "I'm not going to argue with you, ma'am. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have no choice but to involve security." That was the moment Jordan had been waiting for. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Go ahead, call them. But while you do, remember that you're about to escalate a situation already under scrutiny. This isn't just about a delayed meal anymore. It's about how your establishment treats customers based on skin color. And I guarantee the footage I'm streaming right now will make that perfectly clear." Ryan's eyes flickered toward the phone in Jordan's hand, realizing for the first time that the screen was live. A small red dot glowed in the corner, and the comments section scrolled rapidly. "Unbelievable. Why is she still sitting there without service? Lancaster? Never dining there again. His composure cracked, just slightly. He stepped back, signaling to Sierra at the hostess stand. "Get security." Sierra hesitated, glancing between Ryan and Jordan. She had seen enough to know this wouldn't end quietly, but her loyalty, like many in her position, lay with the paycheck, not the principle. She reached for the phone behind the stand and dialed. Liam, emboldened by Ryan's stance, pushed off the bar and strolled toward the table. He smirked at Jordan. "Making a big fuss over nothing, huh? Typical." Jordan's eyes didn't leave Ryan. Nothing? Ignoring a 75-year-old woman for over an hour, seating white patrons who walked in after her, and now calling security on the son who dared to ask why? If that's nothing to you, Liam, it says more about you than it does about us. The words hit harder than expected. Liam's smirk faltered. He wasn't used to being called out so publicly, especially not by someone who spoke with such quiet authority. His usual defense, feigned ignorance and corporate backing, suddenly felt flimsy. Across the room, other diners watched with varying expressions. Some, mostly older white patrons, looked annoyed, whispering to each other about people making everything about race. Others, younger and more diverse, pulled out phones, recording the unfolding scene. The tension reached a boiling point when two security guards entered the restaurant. Tall, broad-shouldered men in navy uniforms. One of them, Officer Grady, a middle-aged white man with thinning hair, immediately locked eyes with Jordan and Mrs. Parker. His lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "Problem here?" Grady drawled, his hand resting casually on the baton at his belt. Ryan stepped forward, relief washing over his face. "Yes. These two are refusing to leave after being asked multiple times." Grady nodded, already stepping toward Jordan. "Sir, I'm gonna need you to..." Jordan raised his phone, the camera now pointed directly at the officer. "Before you say another word, understand this. You're on live video. Any action you take will be documented, reviewed, and, if necessary, presented in court. So choose your next move wisely." Grady froze, clearly weighing his options. He glanced at Ryan, whose confidence had begun to fray around the edges. The power dynamic was shifting, and they both knew it. Mrs. Parker, still seated, looked up at the officer with quiet dignity. "All I wanted was lunch. Is that really worth calling security over?" The room fell silent. Even the pianist, who had been playing obliviously in the corner, let his hands fall from the keys. For a moment it seemed like reason might prevail. Grady's hand dropped from his belt and he took a half step back. But then Liam, unable to resist one last jab, muttered under his breath, "Should have known better than to expect anything different from her kind." The words were quiet, but in the hushed restaurant they landed like a gunshot. Jordan's eyes flashed, and for the first time, his composure cracked. "What did you just say?" Liam, emboldened by the presence of security, shrugged. "You heard me." Ryan, realizing the situation had spiraled beyond control, stepped between them. "That's enough, everyone calm down." But it was too late. The damage was done. Phones captured the moment Liam's mask slipped, exposing the raw prejudice beneath the surface-level professionalism. Jordan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He looked at his mother, who met his gaze with the quiet strength she had always carried. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every person who had been dismissed, degraded, and denied their dignity in places like this. Turning back to Ryan, Jordan spoke with chilling clarity. "You've made your position clear, now let me make mine. This restaurant will answer for what happened here today, not just in the court of public opinion, but in a court of law. I suggest you prepare for the fallout." Ryan's face paled. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Behind him, Sierra was already scrolling through her phone, eyes wide as she read the headlines popping up in real time. "Prominent civil rights attorney confronts racism at upscale restaurant." Live, elderly black woman denied service. For over an hour, Sun takes action. Lancaster restaurant faces backlash over alleged discrimination. The tide had turned, and everyone in the room could feel it. As Jordan slipped his phone into his pocket, Grady stepped aside, no longer eager to play enforcer. The other security guard, younger and clearly uncomfortable, muttered, "Maybe we should just let this go." Ryan, realizing he had lost control of the narrative, threw up his hands. "Fine. Stay. Order. Do whatever you want. Just stop making a scene." Mrs. Parker, ever composed, smiled faintly. "All I ever wanted was lunch." Jordan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "And now you're going to serve her, properly, with the respect she deserved from the moment she walked through that door." Liam, visibly shaken, hesitated. Ryan barked, "Do it, now." Reluctantly, Liam grabbed a menu, his hands trembling. Slightly as he placed it in front of Mrs. Parker. "What can I get you?" Mrs. Parker didn't even glance at the menu. She folded her hands neatly on the table and said, "I've lost my appetite." The words hung in the air, final and uncompromising. Jordan leaned in toward Liam, voice low enough for only him to hear. "Remember this moment, because it's the beginning of the end for people like you thinking they can get away with this." Liam swallowed hard, stepping back as though the weight of his choices had finally registered. The restaurant, once a fortress of quiet exclusion, now felt exposed, vulnerable. The staff moved nervously. Patrons whispered behind half-covered mouths, and the warm, ambient lighting suddenly seemed harsh and unforgiving. Jordan took his mother's hand, helping her rise from the table with the same care he had shown her as a child, learning to walk under her watchful eye. Together they moved toward the exit, the silence around them more deafening than any shouting match could have been. But just before they reached the door, Mrs. Parker paused, turning back to face Ryan. "Dignity," she said quietly, "isn't something you give or take. It's something you reveal in yourself and in others. Today you revealed plenty." With that, they stepped outside into the crisp Atlanta air, leaving behind not just a restaurant but an institution now facing the harsh light of accountability. Comment number 1. If you believe Mrs. Parker and Jordan were right to stand their ground. Like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe silence only empowers injustice. But here's the real question. Now that the truth is out, how far will Lancaster and the system that protects it go to strike back? Because if history has taught us anything, it's that power never relinquishes itself without a fight. Stay tuned, this battle is far from over. The heavy glass doors of Lancaster swung shut behind Jordan and Mrs. Parker, but the tension they left inside lingered like smoke after a fire. Ryan Calloway stood near the hostess stand, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face flushed with frustration. Liam Draper, the waiter whose arrogance had set this entire ordeal in motion, leaned against the bar, jaw clenched as he scrolled through his phone. His confidence had waned, replaced by unease, as notifications buzzed non-stop. The live stream Jordan had broadcast hadn't just reached a few sympathetic viewers, it had exploded. Thousands were watching in real time, and the hashtags Justice for Mrs. Parker and Short Boycott Lancaster were already trending on multiple platforms. Comments flooded in, some outraged, others defensive, but the overwhelming consensus was clear. Lancaster had crossed a line, and the world was watching. Ryan muttered a curse under his breath as he pulled out his phone, dialing the restaurant's owner, Nathan Cross, a wealthy businessman with deep ties to Atlanta's elite. The line rang twice before Cross picked up. "Ryan," Cross's voice came through, calm but clipped. "I'm seeing the videos. What the hell happened?" "Nothing but a misunderstanding," Ryan replied quickly, glancing around to make sure. "No employees were eavesdropping. Some lawyer stirring up drama. We tried to de-escalate, but he refused to leave." There was a pause. Then Cross's voice dropped, cold and precise. "Fix it, now. I don't care what you have to do. This kind of attention, it'll kill us." Ryan swallowed hard. "Understood." He hung up and turned toward Liam, whose face was now drained of color as he stared at his screen. Ryan, you might want to see this." Ryan snatched the phone from Liam's hand and froze. The live stream had been picked up by local news stations. One headline stood out, glaring in bold letters: "Elderly woman denied service at upscale. Restaurant, son's live video exposes discrimination." Beneath it was a still image of Mrs. Parker sitting quietly at her table while Liam sneered down at her. Ryan's heart sank. This was no longer just a social media storm. It was a PR nightmare unfolding in real time. "Get the PR team on the phone," Ryan barked at Sierra, the hostess, who was already frantically typing on her tablet, "and find out if Jordan Parker is still outside." But Jordan and his mother were already gone. They hadn't lingered to gloat or engage with reporters who had started to gather outside the restaurant. Instead, they'd quietly slipped away, heading toward Jordan's parked car at the end of the block. Inside the vehicle, Mrs. Parker sat silently, hands folded in her lap. The streetlights cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting the fine lines etched by years of resilience and quiet strength. "You didn't have to do all that," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. Jordan, still gripping the steering wheel tightly, exhaled slowly. "Yes, I did. And it's not over." He reached for his phone and called his assistant. "Where are we on the complaints?" Her voice came through crisp and efficient. "There are at least 7 documented incidents of racial bias at Lancaster in the past year alone. Most were quietly removed from review sites, but our archive system caught them before they vanished." "Good," Jordan replied, his mind already racing. "Send everything to the legal team. And make sure the media outlets get the full timeline of today's events. I want the public to see the pattern, not just today's incident." As he ended the call, Mrs. Parker looked at her son with a mix of pride and worry. "You're pushing hard, baby. They're not going to take this lying down." Jordan nodded, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I know, but they picked the wrong family this time." Back inside Lancaster, the atmosphere had shifted from quiet elegance to controlled panic. Ryan was pacing near the bar, speaking in hushed tones with a PR consultant who had arrived moments earlier. The consultant, a sharp-dressed woman with platinum blonde hair and an air of practiced crisis management, was already crafting a damage control statement. "We need to own the narrative," she insisted. "Put out a statement apologizing for the misunderstanding and emphasize Lancaster's commitment to diversity and inclusion. We'll frame this as an isolated incident, a lapse in judgment by one employee." "No," Ryan interrupted, his voice harsh. "We're not throwing Liam under the bus. He followed standard procedure." The consultant blinked, momentarily speechless. "Standard procedure? Denying service to an elderly woman based on her race? Do you hear yourself?" Ryan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The consultant sighed and began typing furiously on her tablet. "Fine, I'll soften the language, but you need to be ready for interviews. This isn't going away." Just as she spoke, the restaurant's landline rang. Sierra, still shaken from the confrontation, hesitated before picking it up. "Lancaster, how can I help you?" The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is Detective Caleb Morris with the Atlanta Department of Consumer Affairs. We've received multiple complaints about discriminatory practices at your establishment. I'll be sending investigators tomorrow morning. Make sure your records are available for review." Sierra's face went pale. Let me get the manager." As she handed the phone to Ryan, Liam muttered under his breath. "This is getting blown way out of proportion." Ryan glared at him. "Out of proportion? We're about to have city investigators crawling through our records, and you think this is nothing?" Liam shrugged, defensive. "All I did was treat her like any other difficult customer." Ryan's face darkened. "That's the problem, Liam. You didn't treat her like any other customer. You treated her like she didn't belong here, and now we're all paying for it." While chaos unfolded inside the restaurant, Jordan was already several steps ahead. He had returned to his office downtown, where his legal team was compiling evidence. Not just from today, but from every complaint ever filed against Lancaster. Archived Yelp reviews, screenshots from forums, and emails from former employees painted a damning picture of a restaurant that had quietly enforced an unspoken exclusivity policy for years. Renee, his colleague from the conference, sat across from him, reviewing documents on her laptop. "This isn't just about Lancaster," she muttered, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "This is systemic. Their hiring practices, seating policies, even the way they handle reservations. It's all designed to keep certain people out without ever saying it out loud." Jordan nodded grimly. "Which makes it harder to prove in court, but public opinion, that's already shifting." As if to underscore his point, his phone buzzed with a notification. CNN had picked up the story. The headline was brutal. Prestigious restaurant accused of racial bias, civil rights attorney promises legal action. Jordan smiled faintly. He hadn't promised anything yet, but now that the pressure was mounting, he was more determined than ever to see this through. Meanwhile, Lancaster's owner, Nathan Cross, had finally arrived at the restaurant, his face tight with barely restrained fury. He stormed past diners who were now eating in uncomfortable silence, the earlier elegance of their experience soured by the tension that still hung in the air. "What the hell happened here?" Cross snapped at Ryan, who was standing near the bar, phone pressed to his ear. Ryan ended the call and turned, his expression defeated. "It escalated, fast. Parker streamed the whole thing live. It's everywhere." Cross's face darkened. "We need to contain this. Fire the waiter. Issue a public apology. And for God's sake, make sure the staff understands not to speak to the press." Ryan hesitated. "Firing Liam won't fix this. The problem goes deeper and people are digging." Cross leaned in, voice low and dangerous. "I don't care how deep it goes. You cut the infection before it spreads. Fire the damn waiter." Liam, standing nearby, went rigid. "Wait, what? You said you had my back." Ryan didn't meet his gaze. "You brought this on yourself." "But I was following the rules," Liam protested, panic creeping into his voice. "You said—" "I said nothing," Ryan interrupted coldly. "And if you want a reference for your next job, you'll keep your mouth shut and leave quietly." Liam stood there, stunned. The power he had wielded so carelessly just hours ago had evaporated, leaving nothing but consequences in its wake. Outside, reporters were already gathering, cameras aimed at the entrance. Sierra, the hostess, watched from the window, anxiety etched across her face. "This place is done," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Even if they survive the lawsuit, no one's coming back here." She wasn't wrong. Online reservations for Lancaster had plummeted within hours, and several high-profile clients had already cancelled upcoming events. The restaurant's carefully curated image of exclusivity had been shattered, revealing the ugliness beneath the polished surface. And at the heart of it all was a quiet, dignified woman who had asked for nothing more than the service she was promised. Back at Jordan's office, Mrs. Parker sat quietly as her son paced the room, fielding calls from journalists and legal experts. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," she said softly, watching him with a mixture of pride and concern. Jordan paused, running a hand over his face. "Good, let them sting. It's the only way people learn." She smiled faintly, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Just remember, baby, this fight doesn't end when the headlines fade. It ends when places like Lancaster don't just apologize, but change for good." Jordan nodded, determination hardening his features. "Then we're not done yet." As night fell over Atlanta, Lancaster's lights dimmed earlier than usual. Inside, the staff cleaned tables in near silence, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Outside, the reporters lingered, waiting for the next development. But the real battle was already moving beyond the restaurant's walls. It was heading into courtrooms, boardrooms, and city council meetings, a battle not just for one woman's dignity, but for every person who had ever been told, in ways both subtle and stark, that they didn't belong, and this time the world was watching. The sun had barely risen the next morning when the first signs of retaliation began to surface. Jordan Parker sat at his desk, sipping coffee as he scanned through news articles covering the Lancaster incident. Headlines ranged from "Prestigious restaurant accused of discrimination" to "Civil rights attorney calls out racism in real time." Social media was still ablaze with commentary, and several prominent figures had already weighed in, calling for boycotts and investigations. But Jordan knew the system well enough to recognize when the tide was about to turn. Public outrage was powerful, but it was also fleeting. And powerful institutions didn't just roll over, they fought back, often from the shadows. His phone buzzed. It was Renee, his colleague from the conference. "Jordan," she said without preamble, "have you checked your firm's email this morning?" Jordan frowned, setting down his mug. "No, why?" "Because someone's been busy. Your office's Yelp page is flooded with negative reviews, fake ones, Stuff like predatory law firm, scam artist, threatens small businesses. It's coordinated. Jordan swore under his breath and pulled up the firm's page. Renee wasn't exaggerating. Overnight, dozens of one-star reviews had appeared, all with eerily similar language. It was an old tactic. Discredit the accuser, shift the narrative, muddy the waters until the truth became just one version of events among many. "Who's behind it?" Renee asked, though they both already knew the answer. "Lancaster's PR team," Jordan muttered, already opening a new email draft. "Or someone tied to the owner, Nathan Cross. This isn't amateur work." As he typed, his office phone rang. His assistant, Maria, answered, her voice tense. "Jordan, line 2, it's the police." Jordan's stomach tightened. "Put them through." A gruff voice crackled on the line. "Mr. Parker, this is Officer Grady from the Atlanta PD. We've had some complaints about your firm, allegations of harassment and intimidation. We'll need you to come down to the station for questioning." Jordan's grip on the phone tightened. "Harassment? Of who?" Grady didn't answer directly. "Just come in, Mr. Parker. The sooner we clear this up, the better." The line went dead. Jordan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This was more than just PR damage control. It was a coordinated counterattack designed to intimidate him into backing off. He glanced at his mother, who sat quietly by the window reading the morning paper. She looked up, sensing his tension. "Trouble already?" Jordan nodded. "They're coming after me. Smearing the firm false police reports. It's textbook." Mrs. Parker set down her coffee cup with deliberate calm. "For then you know what to do. You fought worse." He smiled faintly. "I learned from the best." But the retaliation wasn't confined to Jordan's professional life. That afternoon, while he was at the station answering carefully worded questions from Officer Grady, who made no effort to hide his bias, Mrs. Parker received an unexpected visitor at her home. A black SUV with tinted windows idled at the curb for nearly 20 minutes before a man in a crisp gray suit finally stepped out and approached her front porch. He was tall, polished, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Mrs. Parker, ever composed, opened the door just as he reached for the bell. "Can I help you?" she asked, her gaze steady. The man smiled, all charm and no warmth. "Mrs. Parker, my name is Samuel Price. I represent certain interests associated with the Lancaster situation. I was hoping we could have a quick chat." She didn't move from the doorway. "About what?" "Resolution," he said smoothly. "No one wants this to drag out. It's bad for business, bad for reputations. I'm authorized to offer a settlement, a generous one. All you'd need to do is publicly clarify that this was a misunderstanding. No blame, no further action." Mrs. Parker's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Let me make sure I understand. You want me to lie, to pretend my mistreatment never happened, so your clients can keep pretending they're not part of the problem." Price's expression flickered, annoyance quickly masked. "No one's asking you to lie, ma'am. Just reframe the narrative. In exchange, you'll be very comfortable." Mrs. Parker folded her arms. "Comfortable? I've lived through Jim Crow, redlining, and whites-only signs. Comfort was never the goal, justice was." Price sighed, the facade slipping. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. And you're wasting your time," she replied coolly. "Now get off my porch." Price hesitated, then nodded once, curtly. "Your choice. Just know that some fights cost more than they're worth." Mrs. Parker watched him return to the SUV, her heart steady, but her mind racing. This wasn't just about money or reputation anymore. Lancaster and the system it represented was playing for keeps. That night, the retaliation escalated further. Around midnight, Jordan's office was vandalized, windows shattered, red spray paint scrawled across the glass. "Race Beta. Go home." Security footage showed 2 masked figures, but the police predictably found insufficient evidence to pursue the case. An hour later, Mrs. Parker's house was also targeted. She woke to the sound of breaking glass and hurried to the living room, heart pounding. Her front window had been shattered and someone had thrown a brick wrapped in paper. She carefully unfolded the note. "Drop the case, or next time it won't just be windows. Mrs. Parker's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anger. She picked up her phone and called Jordan, who answered immediately. "They hit my house," she said without preamble. "Windows smashed, threat note." Jordan's silence was brief but heavy. "I'm on my way." By the time he arrived, the police were already there, speaking with a neighbor who had witnessed the getaway car speeding off. Jordan showed the officers the note, but one of them, a younger white cop with a bored expression, just shrugged. "Could be kids messing around," the officer said. "Happens all the time." Jordan's eyes narrowed. "Kids don't usually leave threats tied to civil rights cases?" The cop shrugged again. "We'll file a report. Let us know if anything else happens." Jordan watched them drive away, fists clenched at his sides. They're not even pretending to care. Mrs. Parker stood beside him, arms crossed tightly. "Because they think they've already won." Jordan shook his head. "They haven't. Not even close." The next morning, Jordan held a press conference outside, his law firm standing in front of the vandalized windows. Reporters crowded around, cameras flashing as he spoke calmly but firmly. "Last week, my mother was denied service at a restaurant because of the color of her skin." When we spoke out, the retaliation began. False accusations, smear campaigns, threats, even vandalism. This is what happens when power feels threatened. It lashes out. He held up the note from the brick. "But let me be clear. Intimidation won't silence us. We're moving forward with legal action, not just against Lancaster, but against the institutions that enable this kind of systemic discrimination." Mrs. Parker stood beside him, her presence silent but powerful. The cameras loved her, an elderly, black woman, dignified and unyielding, standing tall despite the weight of decades of injustice. The backlash was immediate. Lancaster's PR team released a defensive statement. "We categorically deny any involvement in recent incidents targeting Mr. Parker and his family. Lancaster is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we will cooperate fully with any investigations." But the public wasn't buying it. Social media continued to churn, and more former employees and patrons began sharing their own stories of mistreatment at Lancaster. Stories that had once been whispered in private now shouted for the world to hear. Jordan's legal team filed formal complaints with the city, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and even the State Attorney General's office. They weren't just going after Lancaster anymore. They were targeting the network of enablers that had allowed the restaurant's culture to thrive unchecked. And still, the threats continued. Anonymous emails, cryptic phone calls, even a brief tail by an unmarked car that Jordan shook off with a few quick turns through downtown traffic. But fear, Jordan knew, was the weapon of the weak, and he'd never been one to back down. Comment number 1 if you believe Jordan and Mrs. Parker are right to stand their ground despite the threats. Like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe no one should face retaliation for speaking out against injustice. But here's the real question. When the battle moves from the streets to the courtroom, will justice finally prevail? Or will the system find new ways to protect its own? Stay tuned, because this fight is far from over. The morning after the press conference, the world seemed to shift. News outlets ran with the story, not just local ones, but national platforms too. Images of Mrs. Parker standing tall beside her son, the shattered windows of Jordan's office. Behind them became symbolic. An elderly black woman refusing to bow under pressure. A son using the law as both shield and sword. For a brief moment, it seemed like the tide had turned. The public overwhelmingly sided with the Parkers, calling for accountability and boycotting Lancaster. Online reservations for the restaurant had plummeted by over 70%, and corporate clients were quietly canceling their events, not wanting to be associated with a brand now synonymous with discrimination. Nathan Cross, the owner of Lancaster, finally broke his silence. His PR team crafted a carefully worded statement, which he read during an exclusive interview with a local news station. "Lancaster has always prided itself on being a welcoming space for all," Cross said, his expression rehearsed and somber. "We deeply regret the unfortunate incident involving Mrs. Parker. While we believe there were misunderstandings on both sides, we take full responsibility for our part and have taken immediate steps to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. He continued, announcing the termination of Liam Draper, the waiter whose dismissive behavior had sparked the confrontation. Mr. Draper's conduct was unacceptable and does not reflect Lancaster's values. We have severed ties with him, effective immediately. Liam, now the sacrificial lamb, gave his own bitter interview, painting himself as a scapegoat. They told me to follow protocol, he grumbled, sitting in a worn-out hoodie in front of a plain white wall. I did what they trained us to. Now they're throwing me under the bus to save face. Typical. Jordan watched both interviews from his office, his expression unreadable. His assistant Maria stood nearby, arms crossed. They're trying to close the book on this, she muttered, firing Liam, issuing a half apology, and pretending the problem's solved. Jordan nodded slowly. It's textbook damage. Control. They're betting the public will move on now that someone's been punished. But he knew better. This wasn't over. The real power players, the ones who had authorized the threats, the smear campaign, and the vandalism, were still untouched. Nathan Cross hadn't built Lancaster into an empire by being sloppy. He was calculating, ruthless when cornered, and skilled at playing both sides. Jordan leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. They're trying to cut off the snake's tail while keeping the head intact. But we're not done. He picked up his phone and called Renee. Pull the property records for Lancaster and any associated businesses under Nathan Cross's name. Follow the money. I want to know who's protecting him. While Jordan strategized, Mrs. Parker tried to return to her normal routine. She attended her church's community meeting that afternoon, greeted warmly by familiar faces who had seen her on the news. Everyone wanted to shake her hand, praise her courage, and share their own stories of quiet discrimination faced in restaurants, banks, and hospitals. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. The brick through her window, the threatening note, the black SUV idling outside her house 2 nights prior, those weren't the actions of a restaurant desperate to save face. They were the moves of someone protecting an empire built on exclusion, someone who viewed Mrs. Parker and her son as more than just a PR problem. That night, the first sign of the false victory came quietly. Jordan received an email from an anonymous sender. Drop the case, Liam's gone, you won, don't push further or you'll regret it. Attached was a grainy photo taken from across the street. Mrs. Parker sitting on her front porch, reading a book. The implication was clear. We're still watching. Jordan's jaw tightened as he stared at the image. He forwarded it to his private investigator, adding a brief message. Find out who sent this. I want everything. IP address, metadata, the works. The following day, Lancaster announced a new diversity and inclusion initiative. They partnered with a local non-profit to conduct staff training, invited a few prominent black community leaders to a roundtable discussion, and donated $25,000 to a civil rights organization. Press releases flooded inboxes and social media. Posts showcased smiling employees in diversity workshops, but Jordan wasn't impressed. He knew performative activism when he saw it. Later that afternoon, his assistant Maria burst into his office, eyes wide. Jordan, you need to see this. She handed him a printout of an internal memo leaked from Lancaster's corporate office. It was from Nathan Cross, addressed to senior staff. Effective immediately, we're implementing stricter entry policies to avoid future incidents. All reservations must be pre-approved by management, and walk-ins are to be seated at the manager's discretion. Ensure clientele aligns with brand expectations. Jordan's eyes darkened. They're doubling down, making it harder for people, like my mother, to even step foot inside, all while pretending to be more inclusive. He picked up his phone and called Renee. Did you get those property records? Her voice crackled through the line. Yeah, and you're going to want to sit down for this. Cross doesn't just own Lancaster. He's part of a holding company that controls multiple high-end establishments across the city, restaurants, boutique, hotels, private clubs. And here's the kicker. They all have similar patterns of discrimination complaints. Most were settled quietly, off the books. Jordan closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of realization settling in. This wasn't about one restaurant. It was about an entire ecosystem designed to exclude, while maintaining plausible deniability. "We're not just fighting Lancaster," he murmured. "We're fighting a system built to protect people like Nathan Cross." That evening, as the sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, Jordan sat across from his mother at the kitchen table. The news played softly in the background, another segment discussing Lancaster's so-called reforms. "They think they've won," Mrs. Parker said, quietly stirring her tea. "They fired a waiter, made a donation, and called it justice." Jordan nodded, eyes fixed on his phone as he drafted an email to his legal team. "They think they've closed the book." She looked at her son, pride and worry mingling in her eyes. "But you're about to write a new chapter, aren't you?" He smiled faintly, the same determined glint in his eyes that had carried him through law school, countless courtrooms, and battles most people would have walked away from. "Damn right I am." The false victory had lulled Lancaster and Nathan Cross into a sense of security, but Jordan and Mrs. Parker knew the truth. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And this time, they weren't just going after a restaurant. They were going after the entire structure that allowed it to thrive. The sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Inside Jordan Parker's office, the glow of multiple computer screens illuminated his tired face. His legal team worked tirelessly around him, combing through property records, financial statements, and internal memos tied to Nathan Cross's business empire. What had started as a fight against one restaurant had now exposed a deeper, more insidious network, an entire ecosystem built to quietly exclude under the guise of exclusivity. Renee, Jordan's colleague, leaned over his desk, pushing a thick folder toward him. Cross's holding company, Sterling Crest Ventures, owns not just Lancaster but 5 other high-end establishments across the city. And guess what? Every single one has had complaints filed against them. Discrimination, unfair dismissal, refusal of service, you name it. Most were settled quietly, with NDAs locking victims into silence. Jordan flipped through the documents, each page tightening the knot in his chest. This wasn't negligence. It was policy, an unspoken, systematic approach to gatekeeping disguised as brand management. "They've built a fortress," Jordan muttered. "And they've been getting away with it for years," Renee nodded grimly. The PR stunt with Liam Draper's firing was smoke and mirrors. Cross sacrificed him to calm the storm, while quietly reinforcing the same exclusionary practices. It's business as usual, only now they're more careful. The buzz of Jordan's phone interrupted their conversation. It was Maria, his assistant. Her voice was sharp with urgency. "Jordan, you need to get to your mom's house, now." His heart skipped a beat. What happened? Vandalism, worse than before. Someone trashed the front porch and spray-painted the garage. Cops are already there, but you know how they'll handle it. Jordan didn't need more details. He grabbed his coat, nodded to Renee, and was out the door in seconds. 15 minutes later, he pulled up to his mother's house, headlights washing over the damage. The once pristine white garage door was now defaced with bold red letters. "Drop the case or else." Shattered glass glittered on the porch steps, and the flower pots his mother so carefully tended lay smashed across the walkway. Mrs. Parker stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face an unreadable mask of calm. 2 police officers, both white, stood nearby, speaking quietly with a neighbor. Jordan jumped out of the car, anger burning in his chest. "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine, baby," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "They didn't touch me, just the house." The older of the 2 officers, a stout man with thinning hair, approached Jordan holding a notepad like it was a shield. "Mr. Parker, we've documented the damage, probably kids pulling a prank. Nothing we can do unless you've got footage." Jordan's jaw clenched. "A prank? This is a targeted threat. You really think kids are following civil rights cases and vandalizing houses with specific demands?" The officer shrugged, eyes tired and disinterested. "Without witnesses or security footage, it's speculation. File a report, and we'll add it to the record." Jordan stepped closer, voice cold and precise. "That's not good enough. My mother was threatened, and you're brushing it off like graffiti on a highway underpass. What if they come back? What if next time it's more than paint and broken glass?" The officer's gaze flickered with something between guilt and irritation. "Look, I get you're upset, but we've got real crimes to deal with. Best you tighten up security and let this blow over." Jordan's fists tightened at his sides. He wanted to scream, to demand action. But years in the legal system had taught him the futility of arguing with gatekeepers who had already decided to look the other way. Mrs. Parker stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her son's arm. "Let it go, Jordan. We know they're not here to help." The officer glanced at her, muttered something about wasting resources, and returned to his squad car. Moments later, they were gone, leaving nothing but flashing red taillights and the bitter taste of neglect. Jordan turned to his mother. "We're not staying here tonight. Pack a bag, you're coming with me." But Mrs. Parker shook her head, eyes calm but resolute. "I'm not running from my own home, Jordan. This house has stood through worse than a few cowards with spray paint." "Mom, they're escalating. First the office, now your house. What's next?" Her gaze didn't waver. "The next move is theirs and we'll be ready." Jordan exhaled sharply, knowing there was no arguing with her once her mind was set. Instead, he called a private security company, arranging for surveillance cameras and motion sensor lights to be installed immediately. Within hours, the house was no longer just a home. It was a fortress, watched by unblinking electronic eyes. But the retaliation didn't stop there. The next morning, as Jordan arrived at his office, he found two uniformed officers waiting for him, their expressions carefully blank. "Mr. Parker," one said, holding out a folded paper. "You've been served." Jordan frowned, unfolding the document. It was a cease and desist order filed by Nathan Cross's legal team. The claim? Defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Lancaster's owners were accusing Jordan of conducting a smear campaign that had caused significant financial harm to their business. Renee, who had just stepped out of the elevator, froze when she saw the paper. "They're suing you, Jordan?" Nodded slowly, eyes narrowing as he read the fine print. It wasn't just Lancaster, it was Sterling Crest Ventures, the parent company. Cross wasn't just defending his restaurant. He was weaponizing the legal system to intimidate Jordan into silence. "Classic slapsuit," Jordan muttered, referring to strategic lawsuits against public participation, a tactic used to burden critics with legal fees and drain their resources. Renee's face hardened. "They're trying to bleed you out, make fighting too expensive to continue." Jordan folded the paper neatly and slipped it into his briefcase. "They underestimated my stamina." But the escalation didn't stop at legal threats. That afternoon, Jordan's bank called. His business account had been flagged for suspicious activity, and several transactions were frozen pending review. Clients began calling, confused and frustrated by bounced payments. "It's coordinated," Jordan muttered, pacing his office. "They're hitting from every angle, professionally, financially, personally." Maria, his assistant, poked her head in. "Jordan, there's someone here to see you, says it's urgent." Jordan sighed, rubbing his temples. Who is it now? But when he stepped into the lobby, his frustration turned to cold fury. Nathan Cross stood there, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, hands clasped in front of him like a patient king addressing a subject. Behind him, two men in equally sharp suits flanked him like silent bodyguards. "Mr. Parker," Cross said smoothly, as if they were old friends discussing business over cocktails. "I thought it was time we spoke face to face." Jordan crossed his arms, jaw tight. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here after everything." Cross smiled faintly. "Nerve? No, Mr. Parker. Just practicality. This back and forth is exhausting, don't you think? The lawsuits, the press, the threats, neither of us is winning here, but we could both walk away. Clean slate. You drop the case, I withdraw the suit. Everyone moves on." Jordan's eyes didn't leave Cross's. "And my mother? The threats to her home, the vandalism. You expect me to believe you had nothing to do with that?" Cross's smile didn't falter. "Assumptions can be dangerous, Mr. Parker, but if you're implying I'd waste resources on petty intimidation, you're giving me far too little credit. I prefer battles fought in boardrooms, not on front lawns." Jordan stepped closer, voice low and cold. "You built an empire on exclusion, Cross, and now that someone's pulling back the curtain, you want to play the reasonable businessman? It's not going to work. Not this time." Cross's eyes flickered, the polished facade slipping just slightly. "Careful, Parker. Idealism doesn't pay the bills." And crusades? They leave collateral damage. Walk away while you still can. Jordan didn't flinch. See, that's where you're wrong. This isn't just my fight. It's my mother's, my community's. Every person you've quietly shut out, dismissed and humiliated. And we don't scare easy. Cross's smile vanished entirely. He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate precision. Then, I guess we'll see who breaks first. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his entourage trailing silently behind him. Jordan stood in the middle of his office, heart pounding. The lines had been drawn. This was no longer about one restaurant, one incident, or even one family. It was about power, who wielded it, who suffered under it, and who was brave enough to challenge it. He picked up his phone and called his legal team. File the countersuit and expand the scope. We're not just fighting Lancaster anymore. We are going after Sterling Crest, because now it was war, and Jordan Parker had never been one to lose a fight worth winning. The next morning, Jordan Parker sat in his office, the weight of the battle pressing down on him. His phone buzzed constantly, media requests, concerned friends, and updates from his legal team. He barely heard them. His mind was focused on one thing: taking down Nathan Cross and the entire system that protected him. Renee entered, her expression grim but determined. We found something, and it's bigger than we thought. She dropped a thick folder onto Jordan's desk. He flipped it open, eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents. Property deeds, shell company filings, internal memos. Everything pointed back to Sterling Crest Ventures, Nathan Cross's holding company. But the real bombshell was buried in the last few pages. Sterling Crest isn't just a business entity, Renee said, tapping the papers. It's part of a larger network tied to city officials, zoning boards, and even members of the local Chamber of Commerce. Cross didn't just build an empire, he bought protection. Jordan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. That's how they kept getting away with it. Complaints dismissed, investigations stalled, lawsuits quietly settled. The system wasn't failing, it was working exactly as designed. Renee nodded. Cross has been greasing palms for years, ensuring that anyone who challenged his businesses hit a wall of bureaucratic indifference. That's why the cops brushed off the vandalism at your office and your mum's house. They were never going to act against someone like Cross. Jordan's jaw tightened. Not unless we force their hand. He picked up his phone and dialed Detective Caleb Morris, one of the few officers he knew wasn't compromised. Morris had quietly expressed frustration with how certain cases, especially those involving racial discrimination, often disappeared before reaching prosecution. Morris, Jordan said, when the detective answered. I've got evidence of corruption involving Sterling Crest Ventures. If I send it over, will you look into it? Quietly, there was a pause. Then Morris sighed. If it's solid, I'll bite. But you know what you're stirring up, right? This isn't just Cross, it's half the power players in the city. Jordan's voice hardened. Good, it's time someone cleaned house. He ended the call and forwarded the files, including detailed timelines showing how Cross's businesses had repeatedly avoided accountability through well-timed donations and backroom deals. Within minutes, Morris responded, Got it. This is enough to open a formal investigation. Stay low. If Cross realizes we're onto him, he'll hit back hard. But staying low was never Jordan's style. He didn't just want legal action. He wanted the world to see how deep the rot ran. He called a press conference for that afternoon. Standing on the steps of the Fulton County Courthouse, flanked by Renee, his legal team, and Mrs. Parker, he addressed a crowd of reporters, microphones bristling like porcupine quills in front of him. Over the past week, Jordan began, what started as a case of discrimination against my mother has exposed something far more insidious. Lancaster wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system designed to protect the powerful while quietly excluding those they deemed undesirable. He held up a copy of the documents Renee had uncovered. These are records showing how Nathan Cross and Sterling Crest Ventures systematically avoided accountability by leveraging their connections with city officials and business leaders. Complaints were dismissed, investigations stalled, and victims silenced with NDAs and intimidation. The crowd murmured, cameras flashing as journalists scrambled to capture every word. I've filed a countersuit not just against Lancaster, but against Sterling Crest and its affiliates, Jordan continued. And I've handed over evidence to the Atlanta District Attorney's Office and the Department of Consumer Affairs. This isn't just about one restaurant anymore. It's about dismantling an empire built on exclusion and corruption. As he stepped back from the podium, reporters shouted questions, but Jordan ignored them. His focus was on the battle ahead. That evening, the story exploded across every major news network. Headlines blared: discrimination case uncovers corruption. Network in Atlanta. Nathan Cross and Sterling Crest Ventures under investigation for fraud and discrimination. Cross predictably didn't stay silent. He appeared on a primetime news segment, looking polished but visibly strained. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign," Cross said, his smile forced. "Mr. Parker is using baseless accusations to distract from the fact that his original complaint had no merit. Lancaster never discriminated against Mrs. Parker. This has always been about money and attention, but the public wasn't buying it." Social media erupted with support for Jordan and Mrs. Parker. Former employees of Sterling Crest businesses came forward, sharing stories of how they'd been instructed to subtly steer certain customers away, deny reservations, and, if necessary, claim policy violations as justification. The tipping point came when a whistleblower, an accountant from Sterling Crest, leaked internal emails showing Cross's direct involvement in orchestrating the smear campaign against Jordan's firm. One email in particular stood out: "Make this problem go away. Hit his reputation, freeze his assets, and make sure his mother feels unsafe enough to drop the case. This doesn't end until they back down." The email was undeniable. Cross wasn't just complicit, he was leading the charge. The next morning, federal agents raided Sterling Crest's headquarters. Computers were seized, documents boxed up, and Nathan Cross was seen being escorted out by two stern-faced investigators. The image of Cross, once untouchable, now humbled and handcuffed, dominated the evening news cycle. But for Jordan and Mrs. Parker, the victory felt hollow. Corruption had been exposed, but the scars remained. Vandalized property, threats, and the lingering knowledge that the fight for justice was never truly over. Sitting together on the front porch of Mrs. Parker's home, now fully repaired and protected by security cameras, they watched the sunset in silence. After a long pause, Mrs. Parker spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You did good, baby, but you know this isn't the end. There's always another Nathan Cross out there, always another system trying to push people like us back into the shadows." Jordan nodded, squeezing her hand. "I know, but every time we shine a light, we make it harder for them to hide." As dusk settled over the neighborhood, Jordan's phone buzzed with another news alert. City Council announces independent audit of zoning and business practices following Sterling Crest scandal. For the first time in days, Jordan smiled. The fortress had cracked, and through the fissures, light was finally breaking through. The morning after Nathan Cross's arrest, the city felt different. It wasn't just the headlines plastered across newspapers and glowing on television screens. It was the hushed conversations at coffee shops, the quiet nods exchanged between strangers who recognized what had happened. The powerful man who once ruled Atlanta's high-end hospitality scene was now facing federal charges for fraud, corruption, and civil rights violations. Jordan Parker sat at his desk, eyes scanning the latest legal brief while his phone buzzed, relentlessly. Congratulations poured in from colleagues, community leaders, and even strangers who had followed the case online. But the victory, though significant, felt heavier than he'd expected. Renee entered the office, a worn but satisfied smile on her face. "You did it, Jordan. Cross is out. Sterling Crest is under federal receivership. Lancaster's doors are closed indefinitely." Jordan nodded, setting the brief aside. "Yeah, one less predator in power, but the system that protected him, that's still standing." Renee's smile faded. "True, but you've shown the cracks and now everyone's watching." The real victory, Jordan knew, wasn't just about taking down Cross. It was about changing the landscape that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. And that work was far from finished. Later that afternoon, Jordan drove to his mother's house. The garage door, once defaced with threats, now gleamed with a fresh coat of paint. The security cameras blinked quietly, ever watchful. But the tension that had hung over the home for weeks had lifted. Mrs. Parker sat on the porch, knitting in her lap, a cup of tea steaming beside her. She looked up as Jordan approached, her face softening into a smile. "Well, counselor," she teased, setting aside her knitting, "have you conquered the world yet?" Jordan chuckled, dropping into the chair beside her. "Not quite, but we put a serious dent in it." Mrs. Parker sipped her tea, her gaze drifting to the street where children rode bikes and neighbors chatted on their lawns. "I've seen a lot of fights in my life, Jordan. Some we win, some we don't. But this one, it mattered." He nodded, the weight of the past weeks settling in his chest. It did, but it came at a cost. His firm had weathered the storm, but not without damage. Clients had been spooked by the smear campaign, and while many had returned after the truth came out, some quietly stepped away, not wanting to be associated with controversy. The vandalism, the threats, the sleepless nights, they weren't easily forgotten. And then there was the personal toll. Jordan had spent weeks on edge, constantly watching over his mother, his team, himself. Trust had eroded, not just in institutions but in people who had once seemed like allies. Mrs. Parker reached over, patting his hand gently. "Change always costs, baby, but think of what you gained. How many people now know they don't have to stay silent? How many others will think twice before pulling what Cross did?" Jordan exhaled slowly, nodding. She was right. The fight had illuminated truths that couldn't be ignored. Communities were mobilizing, demanding audits of other businesses tied to Sterling Crest. The City Council had announced an independent task force to review zoning practices and business licensing, promising reforms to prevent another Cross from rising unnoticed. And then there were the people, the faces Jordan would never forget. The young black couple who had quietly thanked him outside the courthouse, sharing how they'd been denied service at another Sterling Crest property months before. The former Lancaster employee who emailed, saying the case had given her the courage to speak out about the discriminatory hiring practices she'd endured. The elderly man at the grocery store who had clasped Jordan's shoulder and simply said, "You stood up when it counted." "I filed the paperwork this morning," Jordan said after a moment. "The Parker Foundation, non-profit, focused on fighting systemic discrimination in hospitality and business licensing. We'll fund legal support, education, and advocacy." Mrs. Parker's eyes shone with quiet pride. "Your father would be proud, so am I." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the world move on as it always did. But this time it moved just a little differently, because one family had refused to stay quiet, and the ripples of their defiance were still spreading as the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the porch. Jordan finally stood, stretching tired muscles. "I should get back. There's always another battle waiting." Mrs. Parker smiled, picking up her knitting once more. "There always is. But don't forget to rest, son. Even warriors need peace." Jordan leaned down, kissed her cheek, and headed to his car. As he drove away, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, illuminating a neighborhood that, for the first time in weeks, felt truly safe. The war wasn't over, but they had won this battle, and sometimes that was enough to keep fighting. The story of Mrs. Parker and her son Jordan isn't just about one act of discrimination at a restaurant. It's a stark reminder of how prejudice often operates, not through overt slurs or obvious signs, but through quiet exclusion, systemic neglect, and institutional complicity. Lancaster wasn't the root of the problem. It was just one branch of a much larger tree, nourished by unchecked power and societal indifference. Through resilience, strategy, and unyielding determination, Jordan and Mrs. Parker didn't just seek personal justice. They exposed an entire network designed to maintain inequality while pretending to promote inclusivity. Their victory didn't come without sacrifice, threats, vandalism, financial strain, and emotional exhaustion. But they stood their ground, proving that silence only empowers oppression. One crucial lesson here is that discrimination thrives in the shadows. It hides behind misunderstandings, company policies, and the assumption that victims will stay quiet to avoid confrontation. But when someone like Jordan steps up, armed with truth and courage, those shadows shrink under the spotlight. Of accountability. Another takeaway. True change requires more than individual victories. It demands systemic reform, community vigilance, and a willingness to challenge injustice at every level. The Parker Foundation, born from this battle, stands as a testament to the power of turning pain into progress. Now the question falls to you. If you witnessed injustice, whether subtle or blatant, would you speak up? Would you risk comfort? To stand for what's right? Comment number 1 if you believe silence is never the answer. Like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe every voice matters in the fight for equality. Thank you for watching and for standing on the side of justice. Remember, the fight against discrimination isn't just for those directly affected, it's a fight for all of us. Stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and as Mrs. Parker would say, always stand tall no matter how strong the wind blows. See you in the next story. Take care and stay safe.